In Revelation chapter 20, it's time to deal with the devil. The Antichrist and the false prophet in Revelation chapter 19 have both been sent into the fires of hell as Jesus returned at his second coming. But now it remains to be seen what happens to the devil himself. Remember, there's a false trinity, the dragon or the devil, the Antichrist or the false Jesus, and the false prophet. Father, Son, Holy Spirit, devil, Antichrist, and the false prophet. Two are already in hell by the second coming, and now we deal with the devil. In Revelation chapter 20, then, we see the binding of Satan into hell. And we also see the establishment of Jesus' earthly kingdom for 1,000 years, which is called the Millennial Kingdom. It's a 1,000-year reign of Jesus on earth, as promised in his covenants with Israel, particular with Abraham, which he promised to give a piece of land, with David, where he promised to be a king, and then in the new covenant, where he promised to write his law on Israel's hearts. So let's just jump in and see what happens to the devil. Revelation 20. Then I saw an angel coming down from heaven, holding in his hand the key to the bottomless pit and a great chain. And he seized the dragon, the ancient serpent, who is the devil and Satan. We can't miss who that is. And he bound him for 1,000 years. Now, there's been so much discussion about this. Is it literal? Is it figurative? The way I look at it is 1,000 years. He says 1,000 years, so why not take it at its face value? He's binding him for a literal period of 1,000 years. And he threw him into the pit, that is hell, and shut it and sealed it over him so that he might not deceive the nations any longer until the 1,000 years were ended. Now, there's a lot happening here. It's like, okay, where the Lord is putting him in the pit, but there's a purpose so that there won't be a deception of the nations for 1,000 years. That means we're not yet in heaven. That means the time is not yet finished. That means earth is still going to go on for at least another 1,000 years without the devil's influence. There's a purpose to this. And after that, he's going to be released for a little while. Now that raises a question right away. Why is it that the devil would be released for 1,000 years? Why not just, blow the whistle and say the game is over? Why would there be this period of putting the devil in prison for 1,000 years? Well, we can only conjecture here. Part of it's in the text. Part of it's so that he wouldn't deceive the nations anymore. But why is that a big deal? Well, maybe part of it is so that as God's justice has been on display throughout all of Earth's history. By the way, why is God's justice on display? Well, there's been a rebellion behind the scenes, right? The angels have rebelled in heaven, and so all throughout history, God's justice has been on display. And sometimes his mercy, but his justice has God been just in judging the angels and sending them to hell? And is God just in judging us? And I can imagine us standing before God and saying, hey, this is a rigged game. I've heard this before. You made the devil, and the devil made me do it. And so, it's not fair. So here's a period of 1,000 years when the devil is not able to tinker, and we can't now point to God and say, you did it. More than once I've quoted Deuteronomy 32, verses 8 and 9, where after Babel, it says the Lord God set the boundaries of the nations, and he did so according to the number of sons of God. And I argued that he allowed these demonic and angelic forces to tinker in the affairs of man after Babel because that's what we wanted to do. We wanted to make a name for ourselves and go to heaven on our own. One nation, Deuteronomy 32:9, Israel, he kept to himself. And so there's always been this demonic tinkering behind the scenes. That's what we see in the book of Daniel, where the prince of Persia, the prince of Greece. I've talked about all this. Go back and look at the Daniel flyover. But now, for 1,000 years, we can't say the devil made me do it. There's sin in our own hearts. So it could be for that. Also, there is this covenant or covenants that were made to Abraham and the forefathers. God did say to Abraham, I am going to give you this piece of property. It goes from the river of Egypt, which is the Wadi El Arish, that's in the middle of Sinai, to the great river, that's the Euphrates. That's the boundary of the land. Now, Israel's never really possessed that in full. Closest they came was in Solomon's time, but they've never really possessed it. And God hasn't fulfilled that promise yet. It will be fulfilled under Jesus. So unless we spiritualize that away, this is a promise yet to be fulfilled. So during this period when the devil is bound, Israel will fulfill that as she plays hosts to the nations which stream into Jerusalem to pay homage to Jesus. Literal covenants, literal fulfillment. Jesus will sit on a throne that was promised to David in 2 Samuel 7. And Israel will turn to Jesus, and his law will be written on their hearts. That's Jeremiah 31:31. This is the Abrahamic covenant, the Davidic covenant, the new covenant. This 1,000-year reign is a fulfillment of all of those covenants to Israel in history. Now, there's greater fulfillments for that, for sure. I'm not saying that it doesn't relate to us as the church in a greater capacity, certainly. But there are earthly fulfillments to this that have not yet been completed. So put the devil away for 1,000 years, and Jesus reigns for 1,000 years. But the problem is going to be is that sin is not yet eradicated. And we'll talk about that in the future. So, as we go forward here, we see that he's thrown in this pit for 1,000 years. He might not deceive the nations, but then he must be released. So, verse 4. Then I saw thrones, and seated on them were those to whom the authority to judge was committed. And I saw the souls of those who had been beheaded for the testimony of Jesus, and for the word of God, and those who had not worshipped the beast or its image, and had not received its mark on their foreheads or on their hands. Well, before we go any further, who are they? Well, those are the Tribulation Martyrs. Now, we've seen them already in chapter 6, verse 10. These are the souls who are under the altar of God, who are crying out for justice. They want to know how long, and God says, you need to wait because the full number has not yet come in. So notice it calls them souls. These are beings, but they were killed on earth. They didn't receive the mark. They didn't receive the 666. They were killed. They're crying out for justice. God has told them to wait. And it says, the interesting part in verse 4, they came to life and reigned with Christ for this 1,000 years. What does it mean they came to life? They're already under the throne, Revelation 6:10. They're already crying out. They must be alive. Well, understand what it means they came to life. Here's a quick anthropology lesson. What does it take to be human? It takes an immaterial and a material part, or body, soul, and spirit, if you would. So what happens when you die is your material and your immaterial separate. You're still conscious. So whether you want to call it soul and spirit or your body, soul, and spirit, there's a separation. Let's go with the three part. Your body gives you an understanding of the world. There's your senses. Your spirit gives, your soul gives you an understanding of yourself. Hello, it's me. Yes, it's me. That's, your emotions, your intellect, your will. And your soul gives you this understanding of God, or immaterial and material. When you die, there's a separation of the body. It's like, you cut your hair off, your hair's on the floor, it's no longer you, it's not attached. Well, when you die, your body separates, it's no longer you. But your immaterial is awake, it's alive, and if you know Jesus, you're in the presence of Jesus. But you're in a disembodied state, an intermediate state. You're conscious, you're before the Lord, you're in heaven. But, according to 1 Corinthians 15, we will be given new resurrection bodies. We're intended to have those. We'll have those forever. We'll see in a couple more videos that there'll be a new heavens and a new earth, and we will get new bodies. That's pretty cool. I'm hoping for an avatar kind of body, but we'll see. But to be totally human, you need a new body and the immaterial part kind of glued back together. This is bizarre, but this is how you make sense of 1 Corinthians 15. So when they come alive, they're getting their new bodies, and they're getting put back together. They're not supposed to be hanging out under the altar of God forever, because they're coming back to earth to reign with Jesus for 1,000 years. That's what it's talking about. So they come to Jesus and they reign with him for 1,000 years. Again, it's a literal 1,000 years. They come back with Jesus. They're alive. They're in bodies. They have been martyred, but now they're no longer martyred. They're living with Jesus. This is cool. It's a very particular subset that we're talking about here. Then there's a really weird section, and at verse 5 it says, the rest of the dead did not come to life, again, same understanding of life, until the 1,000 years were ended. This is the first resurrection. Now, that is a little more difficult to parse out. The rest of the dead, it possibly, and I think this is what it's talking about, the rest of the dead meaning all of those that don't know Jesus. That's what I think it's talking about, because of what comes afterwards. And here's why I'll argue that. The rest of the dead, let's assume, that don't know Jesus, they didn't come to life to the end of the 1,000 years, because it's already been talking about judgment. It's already talking about those people who've been killed at the supper where they eat your flesh at the end of chapter 19. The rest of the dead did not come until the 1,000 years were ended. They don't get to get into this kingdom. They're kind of like in this holding tank of hell, and they're not being resurrected yet for judgment. Hold on. Then he says this is the first resurrection. Don't think first in terms of number. Think first in terms of kind. Resurrection to life, as opposed to resurrection to dead. Here's why I say that. Keep reading. Blessed and holy is the one who shares in the first resurrection. First resurrection. Why is it blessed and holy? Because you're being resurrected to life, as opposed to resurrected to death and judgment. How do I know that? Keep reading. Over such, the second death. He's playing on words here. First resurrection, second death. That's a pretty skillful way of saying first resurrection is to life, second resurrection is to second death. First resurrection is to first life, second resurrection is to second death. He's shortening them, saying first resurrection, implied life, implied second resurrection, second death. Get it? It's not first in terms of number. Come on. There are resurrections in the Old Testament. Elijah and Elisha raised the dead. Lazarus was raised. Jesus was raised. The rapture has resurrections. Peter and Paul raised the dead. This is not first in terms of number. This is first in terms of kind. So resurrection to life. Blessed are those who are resurrected to life. The second death has no power over them. That's hell. But they will be priests of God and of Christ, and they will reign with him for 1,000 years. So now let me make sense of that. What he's saying is, blessed are those who are going to live forever. They're resurrected into life. They get these new bodies. They get to reign with Jesus for 1,000 years and forever. But not so with those who are going to be, at the end of the 1,000 years, resurrected to judgment and death. And that's exactly where this goes at the end of chapter 20, when he talks about the great white throne judgment. The context rules here. And even though this video is not there yet, it will be quickly when we get to the second resurrection to death. Let me put this in another way, because I know it kind of gets a little complicated here. So let me zoom out and say, okay, what are we talking about here? He's talking about Jesus coming back and actually reigning for 1,000 years. And he's zooming in on a snapshot of these tribulation martyrs, because we've been talking about them before in chapter 6. They're the ones crying out, how long, how long, how long? So he answers it. All right, now's the time. You get to be resurrected. Boom, you get new bodies. You come back with Jesus for 1,000 years. And in fact, everybody that has been up in heaven with Jesus at the wedding supper of the Lamb, the implication is you come back to it. And you're going to come back with resurrection bodies. And we will see in future chapters, and there are not many left, they are coming back with Jesus. And we're going to reign with Jesus. So you don't have to take my word for it. We're going to see it in the future chapters. That's the first resurrection in kind. And blessed are those who do that. And you're going to reign with Jesus, yes, for 1,000 years on earth. Now, why did he set it up that way? Fulfilling his promises to Israel. To be able to show his justice. The devil didn't make me do it. And to be able to show his grace, his justice, and the fact that even though he's reigning, there's still a problem inside of us. So he reigns for 1,000 years. And blessed are those that are with him. But not so those who are going to participate in the second resurrection unto the second death, because they've rejected Jesus. We're not talking about heaven yet. That's a really important point. We're not yet there. That's not until the end of the book. We're still talking about the program that takes place on earth. And that's what makes this a little confusing. And that's what makes studying Revelation a little confusing, because you have to keep all these pieces straight in your head. And so, now what happens? Let's go forward. And when the 1,000 years were ended, this is verse 7, Satan will be released from his prison. Okay, again, literal 1,000 years. Satan is released. And he will come to deceive the nations that are at the far corners of the earth. And then it says Gog and Magog, to gather them for battle. Now that's a reference back to Ezekiel 38, and I'm not going to cover it all in great detail and who are they and where they. He's going to be released. He's going to gather the nations for battle. Their numbers like the sand of the sea. So he's going to stage a rebellion at the end of 1,000 years. Well, oh my goodness, what happens after all this? Are we going to lose our salvation again? Be at peace. How do you get all of these nations to rebel after 1,000 years? Well, I'll give you the quick and down and dirty version, but we'll address it again, I'm sure, maybe next time. So what happens is, when Jesus establishes his 1,000-year reign at the end of the tribulation, he's going to hold what's called a sheep and goat judgment. I'm going to address that in the next video. In the sheep and goat judgment, everybody that's a believer enters into his 1,000-year reign. But not everybody's the same. We, the church, who comes back with him, we get these new resurrection bodies. And we're not given in marriage. We just enter. We're with Jesus. We are forever saved, forever with him. But there are people who make it through the tribulation who are saved and who do enter the kingdom. And they enter as people. Sin is not yet eradicated. That's why he's got to rule the nations with a rod of iron. Remember Psalm 2? I said, keep that in your head. Sin is still in the heart. It's just the devil can't make us do it. Those people, they may enter as Christians, but 1,000 years is a lot of time to have a lot of babies. And during that 1,000 years, you still have to get saved. How do you get saved? By grace, through faith in Jesus. But not everybody's going to want to. 1,000 years is a lot of time to have a lot of babies who don't want to follow Jesus. So at the end of 1,000 years, there's another rebellion that takes place in the heart of man. It proves the justice of God, and it shows it doesn't take the devil to get us to rebel against God. So at the end of the 1,000 years, the devil comes out, and what happens is these nations then will rebel against Jesus. And this time, Jesus puts it down quickly. Verse 9, they marched up over the broad plain of the earth, surrounded the camp of the saints in the beloved city. So they come to Jerusalem again. They surround the saints, that'd be us. But fire came down from heaven and consumed them. And the devil who deceived them was thrown into the lake of fire and sulfur where the beast and the false prophet were, and they will be tormented day and night forever and ever. End of story of evil, of the devil, of the Antichrist, of the false prophet. Hell will be locked forever, and evil will be eternally confined, never again to exist. End of story for evil. And from that point on, well, first we have to talk about the judgments, but then we're going to be talking about, what is eternity going to look like without this evil thing? Now, wow, what is it that has happened here in this chapter? So we've had a lot of stuff happen here. Let's look back and say, well, first of all, when Jesus comes back and he establishes his 1,000-year literal reign, we're going to see next video. He holds a judgment, and he lets people into his kingdom who are believers. Some are going to come back with him. That'd be us. We come back in these resurrection bodies. We come back raised to life. The immaterial part's given material part. And we come back new people, and we are forever saved. And we're with Jesus. But there's going to be other people coming through the 1,000 years who have believed in him through the tribulation, who lived through the tribulation, but they are not yet in resurrection bodies. And they're going to procreate, and they're going to have many, many children. And 1,000 years is a lot of time to have kids who are not yet saved. They still have to get saved by grace, through faith, like always in Jesus. But many of them apparently don't get saved. And after 1,000 years of babies, There's going to be another rebellion when the devil is released. It shows that God's justice is right, and it shows that we didn't need the devil to make us sin. At the end of that 1,000 years reign, when the devil is released from prison, at the end of that 1,000 years, when that rebellion happens, fire comes from heaven, destroys that last rebellion, takes the devil, locks him eternally in hell. End of story. Only thing that remains to be seen at this point is the final judgment, which is called the Great White Throne Judgment. And then the descent of the New Jerusalem, which is also bizarre, and a recreation of the heavens and the earth. And you think it's been bizarre up to this point. It gets better and better. And it's just like, it is beyond what any mind has conceived. And as we finish the book of Revelation, that's where we're going. See you there.